Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and I know a bunch of you on my social media platforms have been very excited about this particular build. In this build video, I'm going to show you what it takes to put together your own ritualistic style deer skull mask made completely out of my HD foam and foam clay. Because it's just foam, this mask weighs next to nothing and honestly is pretty easy to put together. In fact, if you would like to make your own, I have free PDF files available over on my website that you can download to build right along with me. And if you would like to support my channel, by all means go through the links that are in the description section, those that are on my website, and pick up some HD foam and foam clay. Every time you do, it supports me and this channel, which means I get to continue to make awesome things like this, show you how to put it all together, and most importantly, give you free PDF files. So I want to show you what it takes to put this deer skull mask together and paint it. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start by taking part A and transferring that onto some 6mm foam, making sure to note the two cut lines. Part B is also going to be traced and cut out of some 6mm foam. With these sections cut out, I can now round over the edges with my rotary tool before lightly sealing them with my heat gun. Part C is going to be traced and cut out of some 2mm foam. The nose section of Part B is going to be superglued to the top of this. The upper halves of Part B can now be glued together, and notice that when they're glued together, they make a raised section at the top. The upper sections of Part B can now also be glued onto the Part C substructure. That little bit of foam keeps all of these pieces together. I mark with a pencil where Part B is going to be glued onto Part A. The front of this just glues together at the eye socket, but the back section gets rounded before being glued together. The nose section of Part A can also be glued to the bottom of Part B, leaving a slight overhang in the front. The same gluing process for parts A and B can now be applied to the opposite side. The cuts that I had put into Part A are now folded under and marked with a pencil. Gluing the cuts like this will give the side of the skull some volume. The overlap for the nose is also marked and glued with some Bob Smith superglue. And it's really cool how a couple of flat pieces of foam really start to take on the overall shape of this mask. Part D is going to make up the inside of this nose area, and it's going to be traced and cut out of some 6mm foam. A very sharp hobby knife was used to remove the foam from the middle, but I wanted it to be a little bit cleaner. So by using a paddle on my heat tool, I'm able to burn the foam smooth. The edges of Part D can now be glued to the underside of Part A. As for the sides of Part D, superglue is added and then it's pressed on the inside of the skull. A knife is used to separate the nostril sections a little bit before moving on to Part E. Part E is going to make up some details on the inside of the nostrils, and these are going to be cut out of 2mm foam. And it's small details like this that really help give the mask a more believable appearance. The two Part F pieces are also traced and cut out of some 2mm foam before being glued into place. Using a rotary tool, I smoothed down the two Part B sections around the eye. This is going to make it easier for Part G to lay flat against the skull. Part G is going to make up the bulk of the eye socket, and this is going to be traced and cut out of some 6mm foam. Once cut out, these pieces can be superglued to either side of the skull. I used my rotary tool to round over quite a bit of this eye socket. This is going to give it a more organic shape. I also do this to the parts of the skull that I had those overlaps and to Part D. To bulk out the upper jaw where the teeth are going to go, part H is going to be traced and cut out of some 6mm foam. This section can now be superglued to the inside of the skull. After a little more sanding, I heat sealed these pieces as well. To make the top of the skull a little more sturdy for the antlers, I'm going to add a piece of styrene to the underside. You could also add other types of plastics here for this build or add more foam. The plastic is heated and pressed over a can to give it a rounded shape before it can be glued to the inside of the mask. This upper section should now be perfect for the antlers. I made a template for my antlers just so I could gauge how big I wanted them, but of course you could change that for your build. I'm going to start by cutting a PVC coupler in half. This is going to act as the base for the antlers. The foam where these are going to go is slightly removed using a Forstner bit, and then superglue is used to attach these into place. For the base structure of the antlers, I'm going to be using some 18 gauge steel wire. I'm going to coil this myself, so first I need to figure out exactly how much I'm going to need. Then I could put a hook in the end of my drill and twist the wire until I get the coil that I'm looking for. The wire can now be shaped to match the template that I've drawn out. And I have lots of different sections for all of the different offshoots of the antlers. These sections are just unwound a little bit and then wrapped around the main stem. Some really thin modeling wire is then used to coil around each one of these sections. Even though it's thin, this added wire is just going to help reinforce all of these joints. Now I would like these antlers to be removable to make them easier for transport, so I'm going to use a wooden dowel that fits inside of the PVC coupler. I don't need a lot of wooden dowel, just enough so these sections will set firmly within the skull. Once I'm good with the fit, the dowels can be drilled out and then the wires can be inserted. Just a little bit of superglue will make sure that these stay in place. Because I'm one for overkill, each one of these joints is going to be covered with some epoxy sculpt. This is a two-part compound that when mixed together will eventually become rock hard. To bulk out the antlers, I'm going to be using some tinfoil. This is going to minimize the amount of foam clay needed, which will also help the foam clay dry faster. Because you can only get the tinfoil packed so tight with your fingers, I do use a small screwdriver to help press the material in. With my tinfoil attached, I'm now going to switch over to some self-adhering bandages. This is going to make sure that the tinfoil doesn't come loose and it'll give an additional surface for the foam clay to hold on to. Foam clay is definitely my medium of choice if I'm going organic and lightweight. Water is added to the surface and this is going to help the foam clay adhere. It also is what smooths the foam clay out. Throughout this process, I'm going to be switching back and forth between using my fingers and various tools to help smooth out the surface. And when using foam clay, I always add more than I'm going to need because I'm going to sand away the excess. While the horns are drying, foam clay is also going to be used to smooth out the transitions between the different bone sections on the skull. Just like the horns, water is used to saturate the surface and then foam clay is pressed on top. Once I'm satisfied with how it's bulked up, I'll use various silicone tip tools on my fingers to smooth out the material. Foam clay can also be used to add some texture to the inside of the nose. For the antler sections at the base of the skull, I'm going to cut some small strips of 4mm foam and glue those on first. Again, this is going to minimize the amount of foam clay I have to use and give it a stronger base. Foam clay is then used to bulk up around the PVC pipes, and then silicone tip tools are used to bring the material down and feather it into the surface. The eye sockets for deers are very thin and not very uniform, so I start by applying some foam clay around the socket, and then I pinch the material using my finger and thumb. This makes it look a lot more believable, but until this dries, it can be distorted very easily, so be careful. The same process can then be applied to the opposite side of the skull, and the whole thing is left to dry for at least a day. After 24 hours, the foam clay is starting to dry, but I'm going to let it go a little bit further, so I'm going to work on the teeth. Taking part eye, I transfer and cut this shape out of some 10mm foam. Each individual tooth is cut apart and sanded before I heat seal them and glue them back together. You can see what a huge difference that makes in its overall appearance. After being glued to the skull, I use my rotary tool to add some grooves into the teeth before heat sealing them with my heat gun. The horns have now dried for 2 days, and I use my rotary tool to take away a bunch of the material. Once I've got it knocked down, I'll switch over to some 320 sandpaper or some sanding sponges for a final pass. With the surface pretty smooth, I'm now going to go in with a wire brush to add my details and give it a bone-like appearance. I need to burn out some details into the skull, so I'm going to use my respirator and a detail tip on my heat tool. A heat tool is great for foam and foam clay because of how they react to the high temperature. But as you can see, there are some fumes that come off, so you want to make sure not to do this around your pets, work in a well-ventilated area, and always wear your respirator. And if you're worried, you could always use your drill and rotary tool to add these divots into the skull. The wire brush treatment can also be used on the face of the skull, and it does a fantastic job, not only simulating texture, but also adding those small little pores. With assembly complete, I'm going to seal the foam using 2 to 3 light coats of Plasti-Dip. Once the Plasti-Dip is cured, I'm going to use some red oxide and white flat primers to help prep the surface. The first thing I'm going to do is add a wash over the entire surface of raw sienna using a 1-inch mop brush. This is going to tint all the colors that are down so far, but also give us a base for our additional acrylic layers. Liquitex Heavy Body Unbleached Titanium is now going to be dry brushed over all of the surface, making sure to hit all of the high points because this is going to make all those details that were sculpted in really pop. The same process is also applied to the antlers, but I leave the tips of these a little bit darker. For a highlight layer, Liquitex Heavy Body Parchment is now going to be applied. This is going to be a lot more selective, making sure that I pick detailed areas that I really want to highlight. Now you of course could stop right here and it would be fine. The mask looks great, it looks like bone, it would be perfect for a Halloween decoration or costume, but I'm going to take mine a little bit further. I want mine to look more like a ritualistic mask, so I'm going to wrap it with some jute. Now the jute I have I think blends in with the skull a little too much, so I'm actually going to dye it using some acrylics, specifically Liquitex Cadmium Red and Mars Black. After I've got the color I want, I'm going to press the jute down into the mixture and have it soak up the paint. I'm going to squeeze out as much of the paint as I can, and I'm going to lay it on some parchment paper to dry, using a hairdryer to complete the process. I'm also going to use some leather strips for the antlers as an additional detail. The leather is cut to length and then holes are punched in to make room for the jute twine. As you can see, I wrapped the leather around the antler and then I used some jute to tie it off. My main pile of jute is now dry and I can start the wrap process on the skull. Now at this point I don't have any reference for this, I'm just kind of wrapping the skull where I think it'll look cool and will have visual interest. And this is where I feel you could get really creative with your build depending on what you want to add to your skull. With the skull wrap done, I'm going to use some suede strips and some wooden beads to give it more of that ritualistic feel. The suede strips are threaded through the wooden beads and then they can be tied off. Again, with no plan in mind, I start threading the suede through the jute that I already have wrapped around the skull. The main thing I'm trying to do here is give it an interesting but purposeful look. With my jute, suede, and beads in place, I now need to think how I'm going to attach the skull to my head. For the process, I'm going to use one of my most reliable methods using some 1-inch elastic and tri-glides. This is going to allow the mask to be adjustable to fit me or pretty much anyone else. I use some hot glue on the elastic and wrap it around each end of a tri-glide. Once both ends are secured, they can then be threaded through the opposite side. This is what makes the entire strap adjustable. The elastic can now be glued to the interior of the mask on either side using some hot glue and super glue. This double adhesive method making sure that if one adhesive fails, the other one will catch it. With the elastic in place, I want to make it a little bit more comfortable to wear, so I'm going to add some 1-inch high density upholstery on the inside. This material is cut into some small squares and then hot glued into place. Now I'd love this skull to have some blood, and my buddy Jason had told me about this product called Permablood. It's a fairly thick blood substitute that stays glossy and it dries really fast. For my design, I'm just going simple. I'm going 3 finger strips down the front of the skull, using my fingers and a small brush to make sure it gets down into all the nooks and crannies. I want to make sure that this Permablood pools where real blood would. I used a hairdryer to speed up the process because of the photo shoot and get the video done, but honestly it dried pretty quick on its own. I love what the blood adds to the skull, the gloss versus the matte versus the textures. With all this done, the mask is now complete. So you all can see the steps that I took to put together my own custom ritualistic style deer skull mask. And with spooky season upon us, hopefully a bunch of you will download those patterns to make your own. And if you are building any of my builds or utilizing some HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKSProps on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. I started doing Maker Mondays on my Instagram again, and I just might feature your work. So until next time, build your best with the best. HD foam.